Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. Thanks for tuning in today. Our topic is the gut microbiome, all those good and bacteria in our intestines. I'm pleased to announce my guest is Dr. William Davis, author of the book Supergut, a 4-week plan to reprogram your microbiome, restore health, and lose weight. Dr. Davis, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for being with us.
A pleasure to be here, Lori. Thank you.
So, the gut microbiome, for those of us who sort of pay a lot of attention to the latest health news, we are aware of it. But, regular people, average Americans, may have heard the term, but really don't know what it is because it's rather a new phenomenon within the last decade or so. Can you briefly explain what the gut microbiome is and really why it's so important?
For many years, you're right. We ignored the importance of this microbiome, that is, the collection of microbes that live in the human gastrointestinal tract. The only time we paid attention to it typically was after a course of antibiotics when you had loose bowels and you just got over it and case closed. Well, the opposite is proving true. The microbiome is proving to be a very important player in overall health. And all those antibiotics that we've been exposed to, typically 30 courses of antibiotics, Lori, by age 40. And children, of course, many, many courses, sometimes every year. And that disrupts the microbiome in addition to all the other things in our modern life that disrupts the microbiome, such as herbicides and pesticides and food residues and that sort of thing. And so we've really changed. We've disrupted the composition of our intestinal microbiomes, and we're paying a health price for it.
So, what exactly, when you talk about the good and the bad bacteria, we're talking about trillions of bacteria. Don't all the bacteria in our gut weigh like 2 or 3 pounds?
That's right. It's a real thing. Some people even say it's another organ as important, say, as the liver or the kidneys. It really makes a major contribution. And one of the effects of all the things we've been exposed to over the last several decades is that we've lost important species. One of my favorites is Lactobacillus reuteri, Reuteri, after the German discoverer Gerhard Reuter, Dr. Gerhard Reuter. Well, 96% of us have lost this microbe, so very few people still have this species. Replace it, and some pretty fantastic things happen. One of the effects is that this microbe talks to your brain, and it causes your brain to release the hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin is the hormone of love and empathy. So people who restore this microbe say things like, I like my partner better. I like my family better. I like my coworkers better. I introduce myself to strangers in line for coffee at Starbucks. I'm no longer anxious when I have to go to an office party. In fact, I look forward to talking to everybody. So it also restores a sense that you can understand someone else's point of view. So it's a wonderful collection of social and emotional changes. But in addition to that, the ladies love it especially because it increases dermal collagen and they start to lose their skin wrinkles in about 8 weeks. It also causes deep sleep. I'm a chronic insomniac. I now sleep 9 hours straight through with vivid dreams. It restores youthful muscle, suppresses appetite, it preserves bone density. And Lori, that's one microbe. That's the effect of one microbe being restored.
How do you know that we are missing these certain bacteria? That how do we test the bacteria in our gut?
Well, you can submit stool samples for analyses. That's still a work in progress. There's about a dozen different platforms. They all differ. And we did a little experiment. We submitted, one of my followers submitted 4 samples to 4 different companies and got 4 different results. So those platforms are still a work in progress. But it's a safe assumption, given all the factors in modern life, like the antibiotics, like herbicide, pesticide residues, like food additives, like emulsifying agents in ice cream and salad dressings, common drugs like anti-inflammatory drugs or stomach acid blocking drugs. All these things added together have changed the human microbiome. So it's a safe assumption. You could perform a stool analysis, but you don't have to know that you've been experiencing a major change in the composition of your microbiome and losing such species as Lactobacillus reuteri.
Talk about some of the scientific research that's been done on this. How do we know that this gut microbiome and the things that so many people, such as yourself, are saying about the importance of the gut microbiome are actually true?
Well, as you point out, you could just do a stool analysis and you could see that there's a lack of healthy species. These programs help you interpret these very complex studies. But you can see that you lack healthy species and you have a preponderance, an abundance of unhealthy species. These are species you might have heard of, like E. coli or salmonella, because they're also the species of food poisoning, oddly. They're also stool microbes. One of the peculiar things that has happened is that not only have these unhealthy stool microbes proliferated and then outmuscled the healthy species, they've also ascended. They've ascended up into the small bowel, the 24 feet of small bowel, the ileum, jejunum, duodenum, and stomach. And Lori, I was guilty of thinking that was a rare situation. It's common. In fact, by my estimation, at least 100 million Americans have this, 1 in 3 Americans. One of the ways that this has really come to the forefront of attention is the availability of a new device, a consumer device called the AIRE device, AIRE. Now, your listeners don't have to buy this device, but it's just one way to confirm this phenomenon of microbes having invaded the upper GI tract. And you breathe into this device, and it registers the amount of hydrogen gas you're producing, because humans don't produce hydrogen gas, but microbes do. And it's a way to map out where microbes are. And I thought this was rare. No, it's extremely common. But here's the kicker. When you have this process, 30 feet of unhealthy microbes, these microbes don't live 70 years like a human. They live hours. So there's rapid turnover of trillions of microbes. When they die, they release their debris, their byproducts, into the bloodstream. Some of it gets into the bloodstream. This was groundbreaking evidence that came from Dr. Patrice Canny from Belgium. And they showed that those breakdown products of bacteria enter the bloodstream. This is something they call endotoxemia, but it is a critical process that explains how microbes living in the GI tract can be experienced as rosacea or psoriasis on the skin, or as depression or Alzheimer's dementia in the brain, or as the joint pain and swelling of rheumatoid arthritis. In fact, I would say, Lori, that in light of this evidence, all human disease needs to be reconsidered, redefined in light of this process.
I was really fascinated by, you sort of broke down in your book the types of problems people can experience when they have an unhealthy gut microbiome, and it was physical and also emotional and mental, which you just touched on briefly. So the list is quite long. Can you go over some of the problems, and not just, bowel problems, but things that affect us in all parts of our body? Can you kind of go over some of the problems that can result from an unhealthy gut microbiome?
Yes, Larry, that's key. So yes, these microbes in your gastrointestinal tract can do damage in the gastrointestinal tract. It could lead to ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, diverticular disease, and even colon cancer. But as I mentioned with the process of endotoxemia, this is so important. Those microbes can export their effects to any other organ of the body, whether it's the heart, the brain, the thyroid gland, the liver. And by the way, the liver takes a special beating when this happens, because people don't think of digestion this way. But when you eat something and your gastrointestinal tract breaks it down into the components, proteins, fats, carbohydrates, etc., a lot of those breakdown products first pass through the liver, because there's something called the portal circulation. The intestines drain into the liver via this portal circulation. And so when those endotoxins enter the bloodstream from microbes, it gives the liver a beating. This is a major player in the epidemic of fatty liver that affects more than 50% of Americans now. So there is not an organ, Laura, that escapes the effects of this process that gets its start in the microbiome of the gastrointestinal tract.
Well, I think we've laid out the problem very well. We're going to take a quick break and be right back with Dr. William Davis to talk about what things we need to do to make sure we have a healthy microbiome. And there are a lot of things that we can do to control this situation. So once again, the book is called Supergut, a 4-week plan to reprogram your microbiome, restore health, and lose weight. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living, and we are continuing our discussion with Dr. William Davis, author of the book Supergut, a 4-week plan to reprogram your microbiome, restore health, and lose weight. Well, Dr. Davis, you talked about all the health problems that can result from an unhealthy gut microbiome and talked about some of the benefits of having a healthy one. My favorite one was anti-aging and the buildup of collagen. We all love that. So first and foremost, what do we need to do what do we need to avoid to try to have the right mixture of good bacteria and bad bacteria in our gut? What do we need to avoid?
Well, we need to minimize our exposure to such things as antibiotics. There's a time and place for antibiotics, right? If you have pneumococcal pneumonia, you can't breathe, and you have a fever of 104 degrees, you need an antibiotic. But if you have an upper respiratory viral illness, that's not a good time to take an antibiotic. So we need to minimize, because the effects of antibiotics are not temporary. They can be permanent or long lasting. So minimize that. We try to minimize our exposure to prescription drugs, because most prescription drugs have some kind of impact. And it could be drugs that seem as benign as stomach acid blocking drugs that have a major disruptive effect on the composition of the microbiome. We need to go back to real food. Choose an avocado or eggs or a piece of salmon over some processed food that has umpteen ingredients that have been shown to disrupt the composition of the microbiome. And then we reimplant species, like a garden, like a backyard garden. You plant seeds, and the seeds are not, of course, cucumber seeds, but they're fermented foods. You know, with the invention of refrigeration, home refrigeration in 1927 by the Frigidaire Company, and the development of Freon as a refrigerant, Americans forgot that fermentation of food, whether it was sauerkraut that's fermented, not brine, but sauerkraut, real sauerkraut, or other kimchi, all the wonderful world of fermented foods, we've forgotten about that. And even though our great grandmothers did it all the time, most modern people don't do that anymore. We need to bring those fermented foods back, because it reseeds your gastrointestinal tract. People talk a lot about probiotics. In their current form, probiotics are probably the last thing on the list, because they're concocted in a very haphazard way. They're getting better. And I think the probiotic of the future will be much more powerful. But until we get there, another thing we do is we make yogurts. It doesn't have to be dairy, but dairy is very forgiving when you make yogurt out of it. And what we do is we take it to a prolonged fermentation, because bacteria, of course, don't have mommy and daddy bacteria, right? There's no sexual reproduction of bacteria. There's an asexual reproduction. One microbe becomes two becomes four. Well, Reuteri, that organism I mentioned earlier, doubles every 3 hours. In commercial yogurt manufacturing, they allow it to ferment for 4 hours, which means you have almost nothing. So that's why when we do it, we're going to do it for 36 hours, 12 doublings. We performed a method called flow cytometry to count the number of microbes in our yogurt, and we get about 260 billion with a B, per half cup serving. That's part of the reason why we get these magnificent results.
So I was reading your book, and I have to say, pat myself on the back. I actually do make my own kimchi, and it was so fun, and I love it. And then I realized it was really kind of time consuming, and so now I've gone back to the store bought. And when you talk about yogurt, personally, I'm kind of anti-dairy. I try not to eat any dairy. But you're saying that you're advocating making your own yogurt, and that you can do it without using dairy, correct?
Absolutely. You can use coconut milk, for instance. A very nice fermentation vehicle is of all things hummus. Hummus is very friendly for fermentation. I also ferment a lot of juices. I make a Saccharomyces boulardii cider, for instance. Delicious. It tastes like apple soda, and it's nearly foolproof. It's just putting a little Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a fungus, by the way. It's the cousin of Saccharomyces cerevisiae that's used to ferment beer and wine. But you can use Saccharomyces boulardii, its cousin, to ferment apple cider, for instance. 48 hours on your countertop in your kitchen, and you have this delicious effervescent drink that is a very potent probiotic.
So you definitely recommend people making their own fermented foods, right?
Just like your great grandmother did, exactly.
And is it hard?
No, fermenting vegetables, for instance, is simply a matter of putting it in a, let's say, a large jar. You don't have to buy anything to do this. You can just do this in a large jar. I have a big olive jar, for instance, I saved and cleaned, and then fill it with filtered water. You don't want chlorinated water. Uh, Make it a brine, add salt, maybe a tablespoon of salt per quart of water. Make sure it's non-iodized salt. So we have to remove all the antimicrobial things that you and I are exposed to. So filtered water without chlorine, uniodized salt with no iodine, and then put your veggies. Chop your veggies up. I like to put chopped eggplant, a red onion chopped into small pieces, garlic cloves, and then fill the jar all the way to the top so there's no air at the top, and then cap it lightly, and then leave it out on your counter for a week or 2 weeks or a month. That's the great thing here. It's kind of a controlled rotting process. Things don't rot, they ferment, and you can eat them. So you can imagine for all these last several decades, we were throwing away things that are actually healthier for us. So we want to put that to work. And you know what? Primitive indigenous peoples have been doing this for a long, long time. We're bringing it back.
All right, we're going to take another quick break and be right back with Dr. William Davis. The book is called Supergut. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Healthy Living and continuing our discussion with Dr. William Davis, author of the book Supergut. And so we talked about the value of fermented foods and how you can make them at home. And your book gives very explicit instructions about how to make your own yogurt and fermented vegetables. But can you buy them at the grocery store, Dr. Davis?
You know, Lori, over the last several years, it's become a lot easier. You can go to stores that now sell real fermented sauerkraut. You got to be careful here. Most sauerkraut is just brine and vinegar. There are no microbes in it. So it should say fermented or live cultures or something to that effect. So sauerkraut, as you point out, kimchi is a wonderful fermented food. It's filled typically with all sorts of healthy microbes that have anti-inflammatory effects, blood sugar reducing effects. The organism Pediococcus pentasaceus, for instance, very potent microbe to reduce blood sugar. So that's in kimchi. It's also in fermented meats. We need to make a return to fermented meats. We've forgotten that you can leave meat out raw and cover it, of course, to keep the flies and other pests away. And in a week or so, you have something that is delicious and is filled with healthy microbes. So we have to get beyond this kind of ick factor that many modern people have about fermented foods. You know, the Europeans and the Asians are better at this, so they don't have as much of a disrupted microbiome as Americans do. So our sterile lifestyle, where we wash our hands, use hand sanitizers, try to stay away from microbes, we've got to get over that mindset. There are times when microbes are bad for us, right? We're in the midst of a pandemic, but there are times when we need to embrace microbes.
And talk also about what we feed these good bacteria. You call them prebiotics.
Right. So, like all creatures on this planet, you need to feed them, but they consume things that you can't digest. And so, if you eat an onion, for instance, or let's say some cloves of garlic, there's a prebiotic fibers, a fiber called inulin or fructooligosaccharides in those foods where you can ingest them, but you're incapable of digesting them. The only way they get digested is by the microbes in your GI tract who do have the enzymes that allow them to digest that. When they digest those prebiotic fibers, they convert it to nutrients for us. And these nutrients have fabulous effects. It heals the intestinal lining. It gets into the bloodstream. It reduces blood sugar, reduces insulin resistance, the driving factor behind heart disease, hypertension, and dementia.
All right. Well, this is fascinating information. We're going to take one final break and be right back with Dr. William Davis. The book is called Supergut. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living, and we're talking with Dr. William Davis about the gut microbiome and his book called Supergut. So, Dr. Davis, you mentioned briefly probiotics. A lot of people think that in order to have a healthy microbiome, you need to just take a probiotic. So, can you talk about the value of probiotics? How do we choose one?
The probiotics in their current form, Lori, are really not that important. They're helpful. They help produce intestinal mucus by bacteria. They inhibit the proliferation of pathogenic species, stool species. They do have some modest benefits. But unfortunately, because the science is going so fast, current probiotics are not all that effective. The best probiotics contain what are called keystone species. These are species so important for other species that one microbe helps dozens of other species. And so I list those keystone species in my book, so you don't have to figure this out on your own. Now, the most important thing, I need to emphasize this, the most important thing people can do for a microbiome, after removing those things that disrupt the microbiome, like antibiotics and prescription drugs, et cetera, is those fermented foods. They are more powerful than and fermented foods are virtually free. It's the cost of a cucumber or an eggplant, but beyond that, there's virtually no cost. You don't have to pay $60 or $70 for a fancy probiotic. You can, and they're going to get better, but right now they're not all that helpful.
So you did say that there were a couple of them out on the market. Everybody wants to know which ones. I get a lot of emails. Which probiotics should I take? Are you comfortable saying brand names?
Sure. And I have no relationship with these companies, Lori, so I tell you because I believe in it, not because I'm getting paid for it. But the best one on the market today, I believe, is one called Synbiotic 365, SYN Biotic 365, because it has several keystone species. It has a species of Lactobacillus reuteri. It has another one, very important, called Lactobacillus gasseri. Gasseri is special. It's what's called a bacteriocin powerhouse. It produces 7 so-called bacteriocins. These are natural antibiotics effective against the species of SIBO, of the overgrowth of stool species into the small bowel. So right now, that's my favorite. In the future, there's going to be a lot more as this science gets better, as the industry catches up.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. My thanks to Dr. William Davis. Dr. Davis, thank you so much for all of your research and for joining us here today on Healthy Living.
My pleasure, Lori. Thank you.
Once again, the book is called Supergut, a 4-week plan to reprogram your microbiome, restore health, and lose weight. I'm Lori Johnson. Thanks for joining us on this edition of Healthy Living. We'll see you again next time.